So the session today really came about as a result of requests from our alumni.
Mm.
Quite a few coaches were approaching us and asking us about, um, I suppose, resources and support for developing a reflective practice. And I've known Michelle for a while, and
Yeah, some years.
yeah, and so Michelle came to mind as I was thinking about this topic, and as a way of introducing Michelle, I mean, I know Michelle as both an executive coach and a coaching supervisor, uh, but Michelle, I'd say, is one of the thought leaders around
Mm,
supervision.
get
Yeah,
me.
definitely. I know. Written, well, co-authored two books, written two books, and we were just talking earlier, and there's some additional books about supervision on their way.
Yeah,
Uh, so I'm really grateful that you could make this time today, Michelle. So thank you.
you're
And
very welcome.
I will pass you over because I'm really keen to get into the content with you. So
Oh,
thanks again.
thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation. And this is the moment where, as a speaker, you get a little bit nervous, like, will the slides actually work? We practiced it, we've seen it, but will they actually work on the day? And yes, they do. So yes, the topic today is about 6 steps to creating a reflective habit. It happens to be a very similar title to one of the books I wrote that Damien mentioned. And I guess what I need to preface that with is, I wrote the book not because I consider myself a subject matter expert on the topic, but because it's been a bit of a lifelong struggle to do reflection in a way that I thought I should. And so the book really is capturing that sort of insight moment I had when I realized there was more than one way to reflect. And the book is an opportunity to share that with a wider audience. So the material I'm going to share with you normally takes me longer than half an hour. So I've truncated a little bit, and I intend to go at a bit of a pace. But saying that, I want to pause now and again so that you can digest. I invite you to pop stuff in the chat. I won't be looking at that as we go, but I will look at it when we get to the end of the input. And I really welcome your questions, your curiosities, or anything else that comes up for you as we're journeying together. So, what I'm going to try and do in the time is just clarify what I see as the difference between reflection and reflective practice, give you an opportunity to get into a bit of reflective mood, and pose 3 questions for you to ponder. That's like the preface to getting into some of the meat, and I have 6 experiments for creating a reflective habit that I'm going to share with you. I'll introduce 2 at a time and then pause so you can think about it. And then all but going well, we'll have a bit more time at the end where we can have a chat either in the chat box, or Damien can unmute you if you put your hand up, and we can have a voice discussion. There's also some materials that you'll get after the session to have a play with. And if we've got time, I'll talk to you about experiments 7 and 8. So that's the broad outline. So in terms of positioning this, we're talking about reflection. And if you go to the dictionary, it talks about the act of looking back on something, which sounds rather simple. But as I was musing on my own struggle with reflection, and I was writing the book, I identified actually that it isn't one thing. There's at least 6 things, and that's where the experiments come from. I think there's also a kind of confusion of terms because we talk about reflection, but we also talk about reflective practice. For me, reflective practice is the kind of umbrella term. And within that, we can have independent reflective practice, which you might want to call self-supervision. You might have reflective practice with colleagues, which you could call peer supervision. And of course, you could reflect with a service provider, an actual professional supervisor. That's professional supervision. Now, I think a key thing that isn't captured by that definition of reflection is the iterative nature of reflective practice. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is all in the left-hand column. It's all about how you might reflect independently. But actually, that might feed your conversations with peers. It might feed your supervision discussions. And guess what? Very rarely through reflective practice do we come to a nice, neat, tidy box that says, right, that's done. It often provides us with more fuel and fodder for further reflection. So that's what the arrows are all about. It's an iterative process. And I don't think the definition of reflection quite captures that. So that's, for me, reflective practice. So let's, before we lower ourselves into the detail, take a moment. Here's 3 questions for you to ponder. I wonder what your go-to method is for reflection. Perhaps it was how you were taught in your coach training or supervision training, or perhaps you've picked up something along the way from your colleagues. But if you're going to sit down and do some reflection, how would you do it? And I'd like you to think about where you learnt that, and more importantly, when you last tested that. And what that comes from is that when I was trained as a coach, we were encouraged to do journaling, written reflection. And I did get to a point where I could do that, but I never felt it was natural for me. And actually, however you were taught, I think there's multiple ways of accessing reflection, but you've got to sort of test whether or not what you're doing works for you. So 3 questions there for you to ponder on. I'm just going to give you a moment to perhaps center yourself, put your feet on the ground, take a few nice, deep, resourcing breaths, and just let your mind digest these questions. What's your go-to method for reflection? When did you learn that? And when did you last test that? So notice what's coming up for you, and if there's anything you want to share in the chat, then pop it in the chat. And we're going to move on and in to some input. So as I said at the beginning, reflection sounds like a single thing, but my sense is in order to create a reflective habit, we have to really explore at least 6 things and maybe 8 things. The first thing is about finding space. The second experiment is about finding your focus. The third, finding your preferred approach. So any of you who've done NLP will know about visual, auditory, or kinesthetic processing preferences. The written preference or cognitive preference is just one. My sense is we also have to find our reflective self if we're going to do a good job at reflection. I think we have to find our reason, our motivation for doing it. And often overlooked are finding our reward. Experiments 7 and 8 are in italics because really, unless you've done numbers 1 to 6, you won't have the data to do the 7th and 8th. So let's have a look at these 2 at a time, and then I'll give you some time just to process. So the first experiment is really about finding space. We're all time poor, right? We all feel quite busy. And certainly when I started out in my journey as a coach, I was trying to separate out distinct time, normally after the end of a session, to do my reflection. But what I've learned as I've gone along is actually I have some natural opportunities to pause. So I'm a dog owner. I do a walk in the morning. I do a walk in the evening. And actually, I can use those really quite meaningfully by deliberately thinking about the clients that I've got coming up in the day and really reconnecting with their energy and their issues. And the same at the end of the day, I've got an opportunity to slow down and digest. So the question is, where are your natural opportunities and how might you leverage them? And think about what physical space or place is available to you. If I go back to what I tried to do, I used to work in London and Bristol a lot. I used to try and reflect on the previous client when I was in a coffee shop, barista going mad in the background, looking at my watch to make sure I wasn't late for the next one. In retrospect, why on earth did I feel that was a good place to be? I had the time, but I didn't have the environment. So have a think about what you already know that you've tried and that works well, or tried and has derailed you. But until we find that optimum space, how can we expect to do quality reflection? So that's experiment 1. Experiment 2 is about finding focus. And I think every supervisor will work differently. When I was developing myself as a supervisor, I went to lots of different routes to receive supervision and saw that there's a whole different raft of way of approaching it. And actually, we can learn from that in terms of how we might approach our individual supervision. I think the assumption is often that we'll reflect on a client, and we'll probably reflect on a client that's gone a bit wrong. But actually, we've got many more alternatives. What went well and why did it go well? Of course, there's what was tricky, and we might want to unpick it. Reflection also implies that we're looking back, but actually there's a lovely thing called preflection, which is about planning. So we might envision how we might be with our client and really get ourselves into a good energetic state to do the work. Increasingly, I think we can think about our self-care. It's something that I think lockdown really highlighted how important that is. So if we're not looking after ourselves, then how can we expect to serve? So reflecting independently on your self-care can be a really good agenda item. And for those of you who are more mature in their practice and they're noticing themes and patterns, perhaps you'd even want to spend some time thinking about what your client work is telling you about you. So almost looking at it from the reverse end of the telescope. That's about finding your focus. That's experiments 1 and 2. I'm just going to give you a moment to pause and think what is coming to you, having heard those experiments. I will go back and just put them up so you can digest them. I'll give you a minute. And if anything's coming up that's a query or a question, then pop it in the chat and we'll have a look at it later. Let's move on. Here's experiments 3 and 4. I mentioned earlier that, most of us are encouraged to journal, sort of free writing. We'll start with a pen and paper and let our thoughts unravel. But the question is, do you actually like reflecting in that way? It was something I learnt to do, but it wasn't something I ever really enjoyed doing. I used to sit there looking at a blank paper, willing the words to come. And, sometimes they just refuse to appear. And for a long time, I thought I was a bad reflector because I actually thought that journaling and reflecting were one and the same thing. And then, long story short, I was doing some work, some client work where we were using visual prompts. A colleague of mine had got some abstract photography that we were using to really help engage and deepen conversations. And I was preparing for my own supervision and I picked up those cards. And I was immediately drawn to one more than another, and I wondered what that might mean about the thing that I was trying to reflect on. I also noticed that actually I found it easier to sort of muse and reflect when I was in a car traveling somewhere, or in the train coming back out of London or Bristol, or even when I was walking my dog. And so when the penny dropped that it wasn't that I was bad at reflection, I really was quite bad at journaling. I was good at reflection if I use visual prompts or kinesthetic prompts. And actually, that's no real surprise because I've got dance in my background, so movement has always been important to me. And I think a lot of people are quite visual, which we don't always recognize when we come to something like reflection. So maybe you know what your processing preferences are. They could be visual, they could be auditory, they could be kinesthetic, they could be more cognitive. And increasingly, I've been drawn to poetry. I never did poetry at school. It was one of those things that really left me quite cold. And then through my own clients, they've sometimes recommended or shared a poem that's inspired them for some reason. And I thought, oh my goodness, I really like that. And it's really taken my thoughts somewhere. So have a think about what your assumptions are about what reflection looks like for you, and really think about whether or not your processing preferences are congruent with that. I think the other thing is, don't expect how you are normally to be how you are as a reflective practitioner. I'm generally speaking an introverted thinker, which was another reason why I kind of struggled with understanding why I found reflection so difficult. And yet, if I was preparing for peer supervision or professional supervision and I was planning to talk to people about it, I would do the prep and I would always get something from the conversation. Ironically, I'm an extroverted thinker when it comes to reflection. Who knew? I'm a different person in different settings doing different things. So, really question your assumptions as to how you will find the best reflective self, which comes on to the fourth experiment. The story I tell here is way back when I was both a consultant as well as a coach. I remember taking a consultancy call about 15, 20 minutes before I was due to do some coaching. It was about a disciplinary issue. They didn't have much time. I was really sort of firing at them what they needed to do and what they shouldn't do. I then went on to my coaching call. And at the end of the session, as I'm sure you do, I asked something like, so how was that for you today? And my client said to me, my goodness, you were punchy and pacey today. And I thought, oh my goodness, look at what I've done. I'd taken my consultancy self into my coaching work. And, we did some reasonable work, I think, but it wasn't the person I had intended to be for my coaching clients. And I tell that story because I think there are parallels with reflection. If we've just finished a session with a client and maybe we're at our desk, we've got our computer in front of us, we might sit in the same place and attempt to reflect. What makes us think that being in the same space as we are for our active coaching work is a good space for reflection? Maybe you've done some mindfulness practice, maybe not, but my sense is that having some kind of segue between whatever you were doing and entering into reflective practice space is helpful. So what mindfulness practices work for you? How might you do your transition? And also think about place. I told the coffee shop story earlier, but I've got a chair in my office that I like to sit in and read. If I sit in there and try to reflect, nothing really happens. So it is about finding the place that works for you for reflection. So let's pause. Think about what I've thrown at you. Think about what's true for you. Think if there's anything you'd like to revisit in your creative habit. So as before, if there's anything coming up that you'd like to share, pop it in the chat. Or if you've got any questions, then pop them in the chat and we'll have a look at them later. Let's come on to experiments 5 and 6. Number 5 is about finding your reason. And this is about being really honest. So we all know that reflective practice is a good thing. It's expected of us. And you know what? Just because I know that doesn't make me any more likely to do it or enjoy it. So you have to find your own reason. logically, what we know is, and that's the picture of the spiral clock, the number of coaching hours we have delivered is important if you're thinking about accreditation. But actually, we can accelerate those hours by reflecting on the hours that we've delivered, because I guarantee you, every time you look at the same session, you'll see something else. So that is a logically good reason to do reflection. But actually, that in itself might not motivate you to do it. And I've worked long and hard to really try and understand why I should, could, and want to do it. And the closest I can come to a reason for me is really about surprising myself. So when I've done a really nice piece of reflection and it's moved me somewhere, I begin to have original thoughts. I see myself slightly different. Something shifts in me. It doesn't happen all the time. It does happen some of the time. And of course, I never know whether or not it'll happen when I start, but it might. And that opportunity for surprising myself is the thing that encourages me to dive in, to dip in, to do something. But I really do think this isn't about what it says in the textbook. This isn't about what it says in your training sessions when you were, learning how to be a coach or a supervisor. You've got to find your reason, because only then will you genuinely want to engage with reflection. The sixth experiment is something that I imagine we're pretty good with our clients. If I have working with somebody and they're making change and it's been quite a shift for them, then I'm really pleased for them, and I want to help them anchor it, to celebrate it, to work out how they're going to sustain it. We might spend quite a lot of time not just celebrating what it is that they've done, but how we might mine that for, why was it possible, and how can you celebrate? And again, it's like, do I do that for myself? No. I mean, unless you count chocolate, I I have been known to reward myself with a piece of chocolate. But what are you going to do that if you've done a really nice piece of reflection, or even if you've rocked up for reflection and found that nothing really gave? How are you going to reinforce that that's a good behavior? And again, this is where you have to be honest with yourself about what's really going to work for you. What works for me is I've got a to-do list that I work through. And when I've done a piece of reflection, it almost always is not already on the list. So I add it to the list. Why? So that I can strike it through. I just like striking it off the list, and that's my reward. It's an evidence base that, yep, I've made the time, I've done something really that's good for me, good for my clients, and I can strike it through. So you have to have a think about what you would like by way of reward and reinforcement. What will work for you? So that was experiments 5 and 6. Take a breath, think it through, and see what you think about what your reason might be or your reward might be. Okay, so as before, if there's anything that's coming up for you that you'd like to share, please pop it in the chat. And if it's raising any questions or you simply have some curiosities, then place that in the chat as well for us. So I've thrown quite a lot of information at you, some ideas about how you might create something that's a reflective habit rather than just reflection. It would be lovely to hear where that's taken you to, what you're thinking you might experiment with. And if you could do that either in the chat, maybe we'll have a look at some of the questions, or you can raise your hand and Damien will unmute you and we'll talk it through. I'm just taking off the the slides so that I can see the chat a bit more easily. So we've got a couple of things coming in. So there's something from David here about thinking about the 7 conversations in coaching supervision and its usefulness in reflection. I really like that idea. I think when part of my problem when I'm trying to journal is that empty page looks pretty intimidating. But the 7 conversations would be a lovely structure to think about, you know, what, if I remember it rightly, it's what was happening before for me and the client, what was happening in the session, and then what we're reflecting on after, both me and the client. So yes, that would be a lovely frame to sort of build on, and interesting to see, you know, where you've got the most notes and which bits are empty, because that will tell you something too. There's a question there from, or a comment rather, from Wendy. She's curious about the what, typically focusing on what to change rather than celebrating what well. Wendy, if you could just elaborate that for me a little bit, either by voice or chat, that would be really helpful. And can comment on that. So Elena's saying, really enjoyed the concept of preflection and how I can apply this to my intention around my coaching programs. Yes. So, and throughout the coaching program as well, I would suggest, you know, it's always an opportunity to sort of prepare and to imagine and envision. And it's interesting you talk about ending coaching programs, because I think endings often get short shrift. We kind of think, oh, well, it's, you know, we've come to the end without really thinking about what is our relationship with endings, both ours and our clients. How do we want to sort of glide into that rather than falling off a cliff? Yeah, and, you know, increasingly thinking about that at the start so that we can end well for both parties. So lovely. Great.
There's a question from Bryony, Michelle.
Where I'm now thinking it's probably necessary to have different ways of reflecting for different purposes, different space. Oops, different. Do I have different types of reflections at different purposes? Do I? Yes, I suppose is the quick answer. Then you're going to ask me, what are they? I think there's something for me that I mentioned my dog walks, and they are like bookends of my day. So they will almost always take place. And then sometimes I will notice as I'm doing that something needs more attention. And as I said, I'm quite visual, and when I'm doing a lot of my work, I have these cards on my desk. So that would probably be my kind of what's just beyond view, and might some of the images help me do that? And then, you know, because I've got I've got quite a few templates, I'll either something will go, oh, actually, I think that might help me. Or I can do a bit of a potluck. I'm a bit of an emergent thinker, so I'll whisk through and sort of say, well, maybe that will help. And what tends to happen is when I find something, I go, oh no, I don't want to do that. So I keep on looking, and it will remind me of something. I think I do quite like structure. So something, a grid or a framework might be helpful. But I think this is such a personal thing. You know, what works for me won't work for you. And, you know, the biggest surprise for me was poetry, where I'd really discounted that of ever being of any use to me. And then some of you may have heard of David White. White has a Y, not an I. And some of his poems, you know, they just speak volumes. And I might not have been intending to think about something, but the poem will bring it to me for to sort of signal that it needs more attention, or maybe something that even has resolved. So it's so personal. And this is what I mean by experimenting. You've got to give it things a go to understand what's going to work for you.
Michelle, we're sort of at time. I'm conscious
Yes.
of time. So I just wanted to just say, can you quickly mention the home practice, home experiments you're going to send out after, well, we'll
Yes.
send out on your behalf after the session.
Yeah, so there's 5 templates that I've shared with Catalyst, and I think they're going to email them to you. Each one uses a different processing preference, so you can give things a go and see what works. And if you like it, then there's even more in the book, and I'm offering a discount code for 20% with Routledge. So if you like it, then there's a place to dip in. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I also run a book club that we share some of those prompts every month. Just quickly, there was a question about recording. Think about voice notes, not just writing. So anything that suits you and is safe to do. So
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate such a rich conversation. There's definitely reflections I've taken away in terms of the place for my reflection. Definitely a bit around the visual, because that's really impactful for me as well. So thank you.